Good afternoon. This is Glenna Gallo. I'm the Assistant Superintendent at OSPI for Special Education. We are going to get started here in just a minute, and we just want to turn on the recording so that we make sure that we have this going on. But we have the next 90 minutes dedicated to taking you through the recommendations that went to Superintendent Reichtel from the OSPI Legislative Safety Net Workgroup. We are going to share information about those recommendations, what the superintendent has made a decision on regarding those recommendations, and the next steps. We posted in the chat a link to the complete report from that work group so that it's available to you. And we will post this PowerPoint and a recording of the webinar in the coming week on the Safety Net website at OSPI. We do need a little bit of time to make sure that the closed captionings are appropriate, and then we will get that posted and put out in the next monthly update. We appreciate all of you taking the time to go through this presentation with us. We are going to mute everyone at the beginning so that we can go through the presentation in its entirety. And then we will have an opportunity at the end for you to ask questions or provide comment. And we also have the chat function operating. So you can provide questions or comments to us through the chat message. I just want to double check, make sure that that chat function is working and that you can all see our title slide and hear me well. So if you could just take a moment and click into the chat and write a response to that question before we get started. All right, perfect. Let me know. Someone said that they could hear everything and see the chat, but that they aren't seeing the posted link. That is at the very top. Let me just copy and post it down here again just to make sure that it didn't get lost. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead and start with the work group recommendations. This work started in July of 2017, when we had a legislative directive to pull together a work group of members and representatives across the state to examine the safety net process. You can see this was Engrossed House Bill 2242 that started in 2017, and then we had a corresponding bill in 2018, which changed some of the timelines. But they asked that we create this work group to review the current safety net process, to make recommendations on adjustments to improve the process, and to evaluate the funding level to meet the safety net's purpose. In addition to that, they also asked us to look at several other areas, whether there should be other components in addition to or in place of those that were currently in place that we should consider when making safety net awards, whether an LEA should be able to access safety net when special education enrollment percentage exceeded 13.5%, whether the definition and limitation on the amount provided for high need students should be adjusted, and whether an LEA should have access to safety net when it has a disproportionate concentration of students with higher than statewide average costs, but the students do not meet the threshold for high need students. So for that last one, we were specifically examining for districts who had students who cost more than the amount allocated to them in state and federal special education funds, but below the threshold of approximately $30,000. So those were where we started with. We also were asked to look at the multiplier. And so while this is a presentation that is mostly about the safety net process, There is a part of this that also addresses recommendations on changes to the special education multiplier, which has historically been 0.9309 and changed in the last year to 0.9609. So at the end of the safety net items, we will talk about recommendations on that multiplier. So we're going to follow the following process. We are going to take each of those components that we were asked to review by the legislature and then provide the information of what we were asked to do, what the current status was, what the recommendations were from the committee, and what the superintendent has decided to do with that recommendation. You're going to see that process be followed throughout this. Again, if you want to see the report in its entirety, that is posted immediately on the Safety Net website. So the first recommendation was, how can the process be improved, including how can technical assistance be best provided, and how can the timeline be changed to allow for resubmission. The requirement is that the superintendent must submit the recommendations to the governor and the legislative education and operating budget committees by November 1, 2018, and we are on track to do that. When we looked at the safety net process, we looked at these 6 areas. We looked at the purpose of those funds, the funds used to support safety net, the definition of a high-need student application, the safety net application process, the application review and decision process, and technical assistance for the safety net process. And you'll see a link at the bottom of that complete report. So let's start with the purpose of safety net. You can see that currently safety net funds are to be made available to LEAs with demonstrated needs for special education funding beyond the amounts provided through the special education funding formula. The work group recommended that that purpose remain the same, with the clarification that the purpose is to reimburse LEAs rather than award LEAs, and that reimbursement is for expenditures in excess of all state and federal funding available for special education services to students with disabilities. Superintendent Reichdahl agreed with this recommendation and has requested that it be included in the draft WAC revisions, of which the CR 101 has been posted. The next thing that we're looking at are funds used to support safety net. Currently, those safety net awards are provided to LEAs using a combination of federal IDA funds and dedicated state funds. The work group recommended that instead of being a combination of state and federal funds, that the safety net process use only state funds, and that the over $14 million of federal IDA funds reserved each year remain with other IDA funds allocated to OSPI for administration, state-level activities, with the majority flowed through to LEAs according to the IDEA funding formula. If you look at the complete report in one of the appendix near the back, you will see the impact that that recommendation would have on each LEA, where it shows the additional amount of federal funding that would flow out to each LEA annually. At this time, the superintendent has elected to delay this recommendation. He is planning to request a significant increase in state special education funds over the next 3 biennia. And when we look at the multiplier model, you will see that over the next 3 biennia, we are requesting an increase of over $300 million in state special education funds to LEAs. He felt that implementing this requirement of reallocating the $15 million of IDA funds at the same time that we were making that request for the additional state funds would confound the issue. And so he has requested that this recommendation be delayed until we identify how the impact of the multiplier will be, and then reconsider this issue. At this point, I'm just going to pause and see if anyone has a question or concern You can either do it verbally by unmuting yourself or adding it to the chat. Okay, not seeing any or hearing any at this time, we're going to move on to the next area. Funds used to support safety net. The work group requests that the legislature commit to fully funding the needs of students with disabilities each school year. Having said that, the work group also recognizes that there's long-term fiscal impact due to the increased use of non-public agencies to support students with significant behaviors that needs to be considered by the legislature. They identified that LEAs need to have other sources of additional funding in order to develop internal capacity of staff, including paraeducators, by providing additional training, recruiting specialized staff, and providing competitive pay. With that, the work group also recognized the need to increase professional development and training of school faculty and staff, including paraeducators and educational staff associates, to work with students with significant behavioral needs. The work group wanted to provide additional funding so that LEAs had additional funding to develop internal capacity within their LEA to address these long-term needs rather than placing students out of district for multiple years. And so that was the recommendation of the work group. Those recognitions were acknowledged by Superintendent Rickdahl, who is seeking a significant increase in state special education funds over the next 3 biennia. We feel that total increase of up to $300 million would provide LEAs with the funding to develop that internal capacity, and we will continue to explore other options to do that. So I'm going to, before we move on to the next one, I am going to just double check. We do have some questions in the chat. Does the superintendent understand that the recommendation to exclude IDEA was for the purpose of eliminating the $30,000 threshold? Yes, that was understood. The superintendent supports eliminating the threshold. However, the state also has the capacity and the ability to set that threshold at lower amounts, and has selected to use state funds to buy down that threshold, which could occur to buy it down even further in the coming years. So the superintendent just did not feel that eliminating the threshold at the same time as all of these other changes were occurring made the most fiscal sense, and wanted to allow the system times to adjust with all of these potential changes occurring. The next question was, how much did you say Superintendent Rickdahl is requesting over the next 3 cycles? And by cycles, I'm assuming that that's biennium. And so the decision package is still in process, but should be released over the next month. We are anticipating that it will request an approximate $100 million each biennium. So the first biennium would have a request for approximately $100 million. The second biennium would have a request for approximately $200 million. And the third biennium would have a request for approximately $300 million of state special ed funding. Any other questions at this point? Not seeing or hearing any, I'm going to move on. This slide demonstrates the funds that will be requested by OSPI in the safety net decision package for the 2020-21 biennium. You can see that it shows by school year as well as fiscal year the amount of funds that will be available to support the safety net process. And so you can see the state general fund, the federal IDA funds, the $14 million that we've already discussed, the current funding that is already allocated to the safety net process, as well as our projection for additional state funds needed. These projections have been based on the historical data trends that we've seen, some of which we will show you in the coming slides, and other information is available in the full report. Mary Ellen Parrish is with us, and I just want to give her an opportunity to talk about anything on the slide that I have not covered that you think might be important for the group.
I think it's clear that when we say current funding, we're talking about, as we know it now, the state funding, and this model assumes that the state funding remain constant, as does the federal funding, and that we would, if that were the case, we would need additional funding. And I've gone ahead and estimated that based on an increase in requests each year and an increase in the average annual award for each high need request.
Thank you. We're going to move on to the next portion, which is the definition of a high need student. Currently, that definition means a student eligible for special education services whose properly formulated IEP costs, as calculated on Worksheet C, exceed a multiple of statewide average per pupil expenditures. The work group recommends that OSPI continue to emphasize the importance of compliance with federal and state requirements. OSPI also recognizes that compliance is a general supervision responsibility, which is reviewed through both WISM monitoring, the dispute resolution process, the state auditor's fiscal reviews, and is not limited to the safety net process. The implementation of this recommendation was approved by Superintendent Reichdahl and will be continued. OSPI will continue to emphasize the importance of compliance with all requirements. However, we did make some changes based on how that will be considered. So currently, LEAs apply for safety net funds through an annual application process using Form SPI 1381 according to the schedule published in the annual OSPI Safety Net Bulletin. LEAs may apply for high need students and/or community impact factors and must have billed for federal Medicaid for eligible services prior to requesting safety net awards. Worksheets A and C are used to calculate capacity of the LEA, which means the maximum amount of reimbursement eligibility, and ensure that the IEPs are properly formulated. Those are the current requirements. Looking at the recommendations of the work group, we are requesting from the work group the modification and revision of current language requiring a properly formulated IEP to include a review of a sample of IEPs for each LEA who has not had IEPs reviewed through the WISM process within the last 2 years, or has any unresolved audit issues related to special education that are material in nature. You will see that this recommendation has been approved by Superintendent Reichdahl. We will be determining areas for IEPs to be reviewed by OSPI annually and published in the Safety Net Bulletin. It will be the same areas across the state, and those selected will be determined based on data demonstrating that particular attention needs to be paid to those areas to ensure high rates of compliance. This recommendation is included in those draft revisions. The work group also made several other recommendations around the application process. The first is that the application process should transition from a paper application to an electronic process using a secure file transfer protocol. The second is that LEAs should be required to either submit verification of Medicaid billing when appropriate or receive a deduction calculated by OSPI based on reimbursement potential of services provided by a qualified biller. The last is that a new category of eligibility for students with disabilities served in residential schools and programs for juveniles under the Department of Corrections be added in response to recent legislation. All of these recommendations were approved by Superintendent Reykdal, are included in the draft revisions for the WAC, and funding for the electronic process is included in an OSPI safety net decision package for the 2020-21 biennium. We will be actively working towards reducing the paperwork and documentation needed in hard copy from LEAs to OSPI in an effort to streamline this process. Before we move on to the next set of recommendations, I just want to pause briefly and see if there are any questions or comments over what we talked about. So I do see a question. Does the change to the properly formulated IEP language mean we'll have a review of a sample of IEPs in addition to the IEP for the student we are seeking for, funding for, or instead of reviewing the IEP of the student for whom we seek funding? That is an excellent question. Our anticipated actions is that if the district has already been through a WISM process in the 2 years and has corrected non-compliance, OSPI would not review the IEPs for each student application that is received through the safety net process. There would still be a requirement to submit it for records. However, it would not go through a mandatory compliance review. Did that answer that question? Or are there further questions? Okay. The next question is, if an exception is noted on one of the IEPs selected for review, how will that affect the reimbursement? So we will be talking about that more in the future, but we are putting forth the implementation of a recommendation from the Safety Net Committee to prorate based on compliance errors. So rather than not funding it if there's a compliance error, as is the current practice, we would look at prorating it to address the amount based on the compliance error that was identified. While you see if that answered your questions, I'm going to move on to the next group of recommendations from the work group. Community impact language be modified to clarify that it pertains to the extraordinary costs associated with communities that draw a larger number of students with disabilities in need of special education services to the LEA based on current unique attributes of the LEA that are not related to LEA philosophy, staffing decisions, or service delivery choices. They also recommended that applications cannot include students for whom the LEA is receiving state special education funding. With that, the recommendation was approved by Superintendent Reykdal and is included in the draft WAC revisions. While we move to the next slide, I'm going to just follow up on questions. If our district has not gone through WISM in the last 2 years, we would go through the same long, convoluted submission process we've gone through before with each IEP. Well, Susan, that's an excellent question also. You would submit the same application with each IEP, but the IEP would only be reviewed for fiscal as well as compliance in the areas that are identified in the safety net bulletin that will come out this fall. So at this point, let me give you an example. So off the top of my head, I know that we frequently see errors in IEPs around measurable annual goals and signed emergency response protocols. It is likely that those 2 areas will be selected for review of IEPs, along with a few others. Currently, all IEPs are reviewed for 32 distinct areas. This would be fewer areas and would prioritize the areas that need the most improvement. So they would only be reviewed in those areas. Hopefully, that will clarify that process. The next question that I see is, how will the compliance data be used? I'm not quite sure what you mean. If you mean the compliance data from the WISDOM process that will be used, or if you mean errors identified through the safety net process. So Carrie, if you don't mind just shooting in just a little more detail, I'll come back to that. Oh, I see.
Can you hear me? This is Abby. I'm not really Carrie. I am Abby over at ESD 113. So the question came in from one of my directors, because I've got like 35 people in the room right now. How will the compliance, if there is non-compliance found from random samplings, how will that be used? Will it be a finding? Will it impact the award?
So if there is non-compliance identified through the random sampling, yes, it will be a finding of non-compliance as it is currently, and it will impact the award, but it will impact the award in a lesser way than it does currently. So what we are looking to see is, how would compliance in one area in the review, how would the services be prorated to address that area of non-compliance? We may also be able to, and I'm not sure about this, so I cannot be held accountable to the statement that I'm going to make. And Mary Ellen is writing that down, just to let you know.
We may.
That depending on the opportunity for review and reconsideration, if an LEA has evidence of correction during that review and reconsideration process, we may be able to not reduce or prorate the reimbursement for that student. And I think it will just come down to capacity of LEAs and capacity of OSPI. Our intent is to hold people accountable for compliance and correction of non-compliance, and to not reduce awards unless we absolutely have to for that non-compliance. Did that answer your question?
Yes, close, yes. Yes, that's good.
Okay.
Will it still be a 442 then? Will a non-compliance come up? Yes, okay, thank you.
Yes, because we'll be using it, since they didn't have a WISDOM process, we'll be using it as a monitoring process also.
Okay.
So this slide that has been up for a little while we've had this conversation, just provides some data. As many of you know, I'm relatively new to the state, having arrived here in July of 2017. And a lot of the anecdotal information that I was provided about safety net was about the impact of non-compliance on the awarding of safety net funds. So these data are from the last safety net review process, which occurred during 2017-2018 school years, and just shows that if you look at the very bottom column, we had over 3,000 applications submitted, and of those, 2,793, or 92.6%, were funded. The number that were not funded due to non-compliance were 132 applications, or 4.3%. This is an important figure because a lot of the discussion that I hear around the safety net process is that it's needed to ensure compliance and IEP compliance across the state. And as you can see, this is not a great area of need or something that we're identifying through the safety net process. We also wanted to point out, though, that the small number of IEPs that are impacted due to non-compliance is small relatively, and yet we also recognize the large impact it can have on some districts when those funds are not available due to the lack of compliance. That is something that the Safety Net Workgroup recognized and actively worked to resolve. You can also see that we had 78 applications that were not funded because they did not exceed the threshold, And then we had 13 applications that were not funded because the LEA did not demonstrate capacity for funding. So with that, we just wanted to provide that data so that if you hear those topics raised for conversation within your district, within your region, or legislatively, you are aware of the numbers behind those decisions. The application review and decision process. The work group recommends that the order of the reviews be revised so that high-need student applications are reviewed first, followed by community impact applications. That decision was made based on the current requirements within the WAC and the RCW, and the process had been flipped at some point. They also recommended that decisions wouldn't be made in one of the following ways: recommendation for conditional approval, recommendation for an adjustment on the amount with conditional approval, recommendation for disapproval, and recommendation for conditional prorated funding to address findings of noncompliance. The implementation of these recommendations was approved by Superintendent Reichdahl and is included in draft WAC revisions. The reason that it's conditional funding is that there's a multiple meeting step process that allows the figures to be adjusted based on district capacity and decisions that have been made during the review and reconsideration process. Mary Ellen, is there anything you would like to add?
I think, speaking about the adjustments, those of you who have participated in the process know at that time adjustments are made for whether or not the student participates in the ESY program, or perhaps the student has exited the district since the time that the application was submitted, and the district has notified us of that and an adjustment was made. So that's covered in this too.
Great. The final option on the preceding slide allows for prorating of reimbursement for IEPs with findings of noncompliance. This will allow the State Safety Net Oversight Committee members, which is the group that reviews the applications annually, to potentially provide a partial reimbursement for the portion of the delivered services aligned with the compliant portion of the IEP. The implementation of this recommendation was approved by Superintendent Reichdahl and is included in draft revisions. Along with that, the current process is that the request for review and reconsideration of a decision is limited to a re-review of the original submission. The work group recommended that the rules should be revised to allow for the review of additional documentation, if specifically requested by the committee during the initial review and included in the conditional decision letter. This exception should be limited to unique circumstances and should not be expected by LEAs. This was an area that went through quite a bit of discussion by the work group, and this solution is an attempt to resolve small errors that could be found in the original application. So copying errors, or if something was inadvertently left out, this provides some flexibility for the review committee to look at a complete application, and yet provide some limitations so that they do not have to continuously go back and re-review the same information. Superintendent Reichdahl agreed with the implementation of this recommendation, and it has been included in the draft WAC revisions. Currently, there is no opportunity for a second submission due to unusual circumstances. The work group recommended that LEAs be allowed to request reimbursement for students who enrolled in the LEA after the initial submission deadline, students who have a significant change in services or placement, and students who access extended school year when the decision is made after the initial submission date. The work group recognized that the IEP is a process that goes through multiple changes, sometimes annually and across years, and wanted to provide flexibility to LEAs to be able to recognize and receive reimbursement of expenditures due to changes that occur in the second half of the school year after their original application has been received. Superintendent Reichdahl agrees with the implementation of these recommendations, and they have been included in the draft WAC revisions.
It also could include equipment orders.
Mary Ellen is also saying it could include equipment orders. Also talking about the application review and decision process. Currently, an applicant's request for review and reconsideration of an action by the committee must be made within 20 days from the date of the State Oversight Committee's written determination letter. The work group recommended that the OSPI staff should adjust the application deadlines, the meeting dates, and notification dates to allow for the 20-day request for review and reconsideration process to be extended from 20 to 30 days. The need for this recommendation is acknowledged by Superintendent Reichdahl and is being explored. While those OSPI staff who process these applications identify the need for there to be flexibility in these deadlines, we are exploring the option and the limitation based on the calendar and the end of year and the impact that this would potentially have on it. So we are not prepared to request immediate implementation of this, but will attempt to build in flexibility wherever we can throughout the process. At this point, I'm going to pause and check for additional questions or comments. All right, we have a question. If we have been WISM'd recently, Safety Net will include no further IEP review of any kind. On the other hand, if we haven't been WISM'd recently, our IEPs for high needs individuals would be reviewed in the specific areas noted in the bulletin, and there would be a sampling of other students' IEPs as well, which could have also a financial impact, but to a lesser degree. So Alex, yes, with one small caveat. If you have been WISM'd recently in the past 2 years and you have corrected your non-compliance, then the safety net will not include a further IEP review. However, those IEPs will be required to still be submitted for purposes of record keeping. If you have not been WISM'd in the past 2 years, and I'm not sure the WISM team would appreciate me using it as a verb, IEPs for high needs individuals would be reviewed in the specific areas noted. We would not then go into the district and review additional IEPs as part of the safety net process. That review would be only a sample of the safety net applications included. So we might not look at every single application that you had included, but would review a sample. The next question, Mary Ellen, I believe is for you. Why can we not get reimbursement for a vision specialist who is in the general ed classroom?
You're talking about a certificated person?
So Carrie, if you could just provide that information.
Yeah, it's me again. It's Abby at 113. Sorry. Yes.
Sorry, I'm just going to call you Carrie. I'm
Carrie,
sorry.
Yeah. I did change my name.
Abby, send an email.
Sorry. So yeah, the question was about vision specialist certificated who's working with a blind student in the gen ed classroom. Why is there not reimbursement allowed for that?
Okay, we are confused by that, and so we actually would like to follow up specifically so that if that was a decision that's been made previously,
send an email
we can pull it up and look at it.
Okay.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be along the lines of where we're going, and so we'd like to look at the actual instance to see, to make sure we're giving you the correct answer.
Yeah, and it's
okay. I get it. I'll get more information from the person.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, we're happy to check on that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Moving on, technical assistance for the safety net process. Currently, the legislature provides funding for 2.0 FTE at OSPI to provide training, technical advisement or technical assistance, committee support, conduct an annual survey, and prepare annual reports to the legislature. The work group recommends that OSPI support be increased to 3.0 FTE. Those FTE would be used to not only assist LEAs with these applications and switching to the electronic process, but would also be available to provide additional technical assistance to districts. We also will be changing the annual survey to be an anonymous survey. And then the work group recommends that OSPI staff be allowed to request missing documentation during safety net application reviews. So currently those applications come first to OSPI, and during some initial reviews, OSPI staff may identify that something is missing and will have the flexibility to request it from the LEA prior to it being reviewed and identified as missing by the committee. The last recommendation in this area is that the work group be allowed to reconvene during 2020-2021 to determine if further changes are needed. So the work group felt strongly that significant changes were being requested to be made to the safety net process and wanted an opportunity after several years of the implementation of these changes to come back together and identify whether these changes resolved the concerns, whether there were new concerns, or whether further action was needed. So those recommendations were approved by Superintendent Reichdahl. They are included in both the draft WAC revisions and in the OSPI safety net decision package for the 2020-2021 biennium. Now we're going to move on to the additional request from the Education Task Force. So I just want to be clear that this was a request that went through the Safety Net Legislative Work Group, but it is not safety net related. So the request was for the committee to review and make recommendations regarding the state special ed excess cost funding multiplier. The multiplier was originally set at the basic education allocation BEA times 0.9309, and it was raised to 0.9609 this school year. That successfully increased state special ed funding for approximately $21 million. The work group recognized that increase and also recognized that there was a need for additional funds to replace the funds that were being used from levies to provide special education services as calculated on end-of-year district fiscal reports. They recommend that OSPI consider adoption of a tiered multiplier. The work group was cautious of models based solely on the type of setting or disability category and favored a hybrid model combining hours of service and location of service. At this time, OSPI has data on location of services provided by students. However, we do not collect data on hours of special education services by student. Those who supported this recommendation and were part of the work group felt that districts did already have these data on the hours of service based on IEPs and could provide those data to OSPI with a minimum of effort. The implementation of this recommendation was approved by Superintendent Reichdahl and is included in the OSPI multiplier decision package for 2020-21 and future biennia. What we have next is a preliminary model that has already gone through multiple changes. And so when those decision packages are released in the next month, you will see how this model has been adopted to gradually increase over the next 3 biennia to drive an additional $300 million of state special education funding. So I'm going to take you quickly through the model, again, knowing that things will change. This is the model using data that has been provided by one district in the state. So in the first column, we have district data that shows the number of students in each band of weekly hours of service. The second column shows the weekly hours of service. The third column goes along with the second column, which is the setting. So you can see the first 4 rows show weekly bands of service within the general ed setting 80 to 100% of the time. The next 2 rows show the weekly bands of service in a general ed setting 40 to 79% of the time. Following that would be time in the general ed setting less than 39%. Those students receiving public or private day school, those in a residential facility, and those who are homebound. You can see the BEA allocation is in the next column. And then we are moving to a tiered multiplier that in this example would serve in one biennium to completely eliminate the gap in funding that is currently supplemented by levy funds for this district. So services that could be provided at a lesser cost due to the small quantity or the consolidation in programs would have a lesser multiplier, and an increased multiplier is available for services that are more costly or have less capacity or consolidation. It also serves to provide additional funding for students receiving special education services in the general ed classroom. This is a result of input that OSPI has received from stakeholders, including LEAs, that they would like to start providing additional special ed services in the general ed classroom, but lack the funding capacity to do so. You can see the impact on the rate based on those tiered funding multipliers. While I'm letting you look at that, you can also see that a comparison has been done on the difference in funding using the current multiplier in the very bottom almost column of 0.9609, as well as the change in this tiered system of multipliers. This would, just before I go to the question, this would take, you would look at the IEP and the setting that the student is receiving the majority of their services, and then you would just pull together the total hours of service. So you wouldn't divide up the services by setting. So if the student is in the general ed classroom 80 to 100% of the time, that would be the setting, and then you would just total all of the hours of service on that IEP. So with that, I do see a question. Is there a provision to allow a district to make a coding correction in the event that a service is identified appropriately in an IEP and the services were provided, but the individual was miscoded?
You're talking about miscoded on the S275?
Penny, can you unmute? And
Oh, that's Corrine.
is it?
Oh yeah, Corrine. We talked about it in the change in the process where they could submit corrected information. I think that was addressed in a few slides back. I will.
We're going back.
It was addressed or will be addressed, Corrine. So I'll if we can't find it right now, I'll get that to you via email. There's no option.
We'll make sure that that is just clarified in our internal processes. So thank you. All right, looking at this tiered multiplier model, questions, comments, concerns? Good or bad, however you feel about it.
Glenna, there's a question from my group. This is Abby, not Carrie. So is the safety net, is it safety net? Safety net oversight group going to differentiate with virtual students, online students?
We're getting the 2 decision packages.
So are we talking about, so this would not be safety net. What we're talking about next is the multiplier.
I know. Oh, okay. So that would be it. Yes, the multiplier.
Okay. So at this point, we have not addressed or considered the cost of virtual or online services.
Okay, thank you.
If someone has some recommendations or feels that that needs to be addressed, we're happy to consider that and look at those costs as well. Any other questions about this? Would a district be held harmless if this calculation resulted in less? Or has it been analyzed to see if it will always result in more in what a district received using the 0.9609? So that question is actually is very timely. If Amber, if you could advance to the next slide briefly. We are in the process of running this calculation through multiple tests using district provided data. We would invite all of you to contact Mary Ellen at the email listed below to receive the test template. She will email you the template, you drop in your data, and then let us know the results. We are really trying to make sure that this addresses the need and shouldn't result in less funding for someone unless for some reason their need for services declines. But we are trying to test this through multiple methods and are happy to share the process and get your feedback. The other question that I saw was, does weekly hours of service only include SDI? It would include SDI and related services. So either one of those would count. If there's something that you think we're missing that would not be counted, that should be counted, please share that with us so that we can make sure as we move ahead that that is addressed. This is a pretty radical departure from the longstanding process that has been put in place in Washington, but we believe that it addresses the need and the intentions of the education groups to provide specially designed instruction and related services to meet students' needs. And so we really want to be thoughtful and intentional and have run this through multiple tests to make sure that this is the direction we want to go. One question, if you could go back to the spreadsheet, perfect, says, would it also include SAS? I'm not sure what SAS is. Could somebody define SAS for us? Supplementary aids and services. We believe that it could. So we would need to see some examples of how people are using the supplementary aids and services to make sure that we appropriately address that. So thank you so much. One comment says that funding model provides an incentive to pull kids out for services. It actually does not necessarily, I don't view it that way. And so I would need to know a little bit more about that. As you look at it, you can see that there's a higher multiplier for students who receive more services within the general ed classroom for the majority of the day. We do have some other multipliers that are also high, but it has to do with the expensiveness of those services that are provided. So for example, those students who receive services in a residential facility have a higher multiplier of a 3.0, which will generate $28,000. based on our records, those costs far exceed the $28,000 and would not necessarily hit the threshold also. So we believe that we've addressed that, but if you have additional details that you would like us to consider or you disagree, please provide that either in chat or through email. Mary Ellen will be the best person to receive those. I'm just going back. Abby, you may want to provide me more information about the incentive to pull kids out for students. Thank you. I've heard appreciative of the work to increase funding. Wonder if you could consider advising Superintendent Reichdahl when he is requesting additional funding from the legislature for special ed, that they identify that this funding is for support of students with disabilities and is not intended to increase teacher salaries. That clarity may make future bargaining sessions run smoother. We will provide that input to Superintendent Reichdahl for his consideration. An example, consultation, a BCBA, Board Certified Behavior Analyst, consult or audiologist. Expensive providers who work indirectly with high needs students. So currently it is written that it's direct services to students for safety net purposes. When we're talking about the use of the special education multiplier though, there are no restrictions that it be direct services. So depending on how that is included in the IEP, and if it's under supplementary aids and services, and it's documented in the time, that does seem reasonable to be included.
It seems like they would be hitting over 19 to 24.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you're willing to run those test data for us, let us know what you've included so that we can take that into consideration. The next question is, would the tiers be determined annually or would it be fixed? So at this point, the tiers would change over the next 3 bienniums, so the next 6 years. We would anticipate that they not be fixed for long periods of time as the costs for services change dramatically from biennium to biennium. And we believe that the long history of the 0.9309 may have had some impact on the use of levy funds. So the recommendation is not to have them fixed in perpetuity. We also know that there has to be some flexibility though to create a process that has some stability. A Braille technician, no direct service, but she creates Braille materials all day long for students. No way on safety net to account for her time. So I just want to make sure, Susan, that we are talking about safety net applications, which is not where we're talking about the multiplier. The multiplier is separate from safety net. And so for the safety net application, it is required to be direct services. For students here using the multiplier, you couldn't code a Braille technician who is just providing Braille materials all day for a variety of students, but for the amount of time that she was providing Braille materials as needed for a specific student, you could include that in the hours of service. The other question, is this just for SDI or is a one-on-one para included? And if a one-on-one para was included in the IEP as service time, it would be included. I would like to ask the participants though, that as we're looking at these allocations, to really consider ways that services could be provided within the general ed setting in ways other than the use of a one-on-one para educator. So not that IEP teams shouldn't make that decision, because IEP teams do have the authority, but I think this provides us the funding and allows us to build some capacity to create some new funding and practice models, such as co-teaching, providing additional times or supports by a special ed teacher during general ed class period times. And so I would request that special ed directors really start looking at this model and having conversations within their district about ways that they could change their current practices to provide more effective, specially designed instruction within a general ed classroom. I believe at this time, I have not answered all of the questions. What about special transportation? Special transportation would be a related service, and if it was codified on the IEP with hours of service, it could be included, but there should be a funding mechanism already for the transportation process.
We're departing from, when we looked at setting, we were looking at LRE setting. Remember that. We're talking about the educational program here. And so we would expect that this very closely models what you have in the IEP already. Once again, I'm sort of thinking we're getting the safety net intertwined in this model. And if you would request a copy for your to study and test on your own, you would see that we've carried this out over a 2 or 3 year period, and it will be more helpful to you to understand that with this model, we're talking about your special ed funding revenue 4121.
Is there another state using this model? Not this specific model. We did do a review of the models in place by all states and identified aspects of those that aligned with the values of the safety net legislative work group, which was to ensure that adequate funding was provided to meet the needs of students with disabilities in the least restrictive environment. So that is why I have been calling this a hybrid tiered model, because rather than relying on one issue, it's looking at a number of factors. So Mary Ellen has the report that we use that shows the funding models used by all of the states and could provide that upon request, but this is a unique model. With that, I just want to point out, when we're talking about the hybrid tiered multiplier, you will see a different model that has had some adjustments come out in the OSPI multiplier decision package. That is because the superintendent wants to provide an option to fund this over the next 3 biennium. That will be a conversation for the legislature. This example was to provide the funding immediately to replace that one, levy funds. So you will see some changes in that decision package. Moving on, you can see Mary Ellen's email was provided there. If you would like to participate in a test with the funding model multiplier. With that, let's talk about next steps. So legislatively, the superintendent will submit the recommendations to the governor and the legislative education and operating budget committees by November 1, 2018. We are on timeline to achieve that goal. And then internally at OSPI, we also have several steps that we're working on. The first one is that we have started the process to change the safety net WAC. There's a link here to the CR 101, the pre-proposal statement of inquiry that was filed on September 5th. That's our notification to the public of the intent to revise our rules. We are in the process of doing the CR 102, which is the proposed rulemaking, the notification to the public of the date of the hearing, and the proposed rules will be published. We anticipate that coming out within the next 2 weeks. Following that, we will hold a rules hearing, provide a concise explanatory statement to respond to the feedback provided, and the rules become effective 31 days after filing the CR 103. It is our intent to have these new rules in place in December of 2018 so that they can be implemented immediately for the upcoming safety net application process. We encourage you to participate in this rulemaking process, even if you are in full agreement, to provide that input so that things aren't changed based on a lack of input or very vocal groups who may be contrary to the majority but do speak out. We want to make sure that we hear from everyone who has an interest in this. School district staff, educators, parents, communities, advocates. With that, we will just open it up for questions or comments that we have not already addressed. And so please feel free to type your question or comment into the chat, or in an orderly fashion to unmute yourself and provide it verbally. Just a reminder, this session is being recorded. To clarify, if the rules were changed, the safety net process would change for this school year or for the 19-20 school year. So the majority of the rules would go into effect and take effect for the 2018-2019 school year and the upcoming safety net application process. The part that would be lengthened would be the transition to the electronic process, because OSPI has requested funding to build a system to do that. All of the other changes, if dependent upon the input received during the rules process, would go into effect immediately. A message of thanks, thank you, and all the committee members for these efforts. These are substantial changes that will have a positive impact. I completely agree. This was an excellent committee full of knowledgeable personnel who really had the interest of students with disabilities and made sure that their recommendations aligned with those interests. This was a very thoughtful work group who went through an extensive stakeholder input process and made revisions to their recommendations as a result. And I thoroughly appreciate and enjoyed the work of this group. Just another message, thank you for these changes. Please, these are still recommendations. We're in the process of starting to implement them. This is the perfect time to talk to others within your district and your community to see if there are other areas that need to be considered during this process. I cannot restate enough that this is not a done deal. We are going into the rule revision process in good faith and will respond to public input and may make changes based upon that input. And so please take the time to provide input in whatever format works for you, whether you attend the hearing in person or whether you provide it in writing. The question is, should we still expect the safety net bulletin to come out in the fall? The answer to that is yes. The safety net bulletin will probably come out and then be amended later on. So those of you that are familiar with the significant disproportionality bulletin, where we provided the bulletin with an explanation of the timelines and how they might differ based on some decisions made by the U.S. Department of Ed, and then provided a supplemental bulletin when those decisions were made. So we will be providing a bulletin in the fall with the information that is available at that time, and then we'll supplement that bulletin upon the completion of the rules.
So could we recap what would be a big change for those folks who typically submit? It would be that we would be doing high-cost individual applications first, whereas in the past we've done community impact first. So that means that the deadline for submission for high-need individuals would be sooner than it has been in prior years?
You would still need to submit an IEP application with each high needs individual application. OSPI will make the determination based on the wisdom data of which ones to review. We will be working out a process to provide, to submit applications electronically, and you will receive more information about that. In the meantime, we're looking for a secure process. Those would be the main issues. There is a question, will this recording in PowerPoint be shared with participants? And the answer is yes. If you go back up to the beginning of the chat, we will be providing this PowerPoint and this recording along with closed captions on the Safety Net webpage within the coming week. And so we will also put a link to it and mention it in the next monthly update bulletin so that people are aware that it exists. I encourage you to share the information with your colleagues who were unable to participate. And we appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today on this subject matter. I apologize for my coughing and my low voice during this presentation. The next question, can it be considered to change the Safety Net Oversight Committee meeting at the end of the year to review reimbursement to a webinar? A lot of travel time has been expended on this. That is an excellent suggestion, and we have talked about providing it as both options so that we would have an in-person option and could also potentially Zoom so that people could listen in. I'm not sure that we wish to record them and have to maintain the recordings as we already have an audio recording of the committee. But we are considering Zooming so that people can watch online and ask questions. We are also implementing a change to that committee review of providing one copy of a summary of the district's requests and decisions that are being considered by the committee to the director in attendance, so that rather than those attending having to take notes on every single decision for their district, we would provide them with a draft copy that the Safety Net Committee is working off of that they could use. We're trying to figure out how we would do that, with some participating electronically and some participating in person. And it will be important to know who's planning to participate in advance of that day so that we could have that prepared. Other questions? It looks like we're slowing down on questions, and so I'm going to go ahead and leave it open for final questions or comments. I am going to stop the recording though at this point. At this point, the webinar is officially over. The information has been provided. You can find the complete recommendation report from the committee available on the Safety Net website at this time. And in the coming week, you will find this recording and this PowerPoint available. The last